Lesson 1. What was the Great Depression and why did it happen? In a later lesson, we'll compare the Great Depression to the economic effects of COVID-19. And part of our purpose for diving into and learning about the Great Depression is to be able to understand and make predictions about what's going on economically in our world right now and how it's going to affect people. A lot of people are making comparisons between the Great Depression of the 1930s and the COVID-19 economic issues that we're seeing today. And we want to be able to analyze those claims and see if we think people are right, if this is a good comparison or not. So we'll start with learning about the Great Depression and why it happened. The Great Depression was the worst economic crisis in the history of the industrialized world. It began with the Wall Street stock market crash of 1929 and lasted through the late 1930s. It caused hardships to ordinary people around the world. Let's break this definition down a little bit. Great, in this case, ironically, doesn't mean awesome. It means worst. It means like biggest and most influential. This was the worst crisis that we've seen in a long time. And depression is not a state of mind, but an economic term for a slowdown of economic activity, a crisis. And we can contextualize this in history. So this lasted from 1929 through the late 1930s, which means about 10 years of economic slowdown and hardship. And this happened between the two world wars. So World War I ended in 1918 and World War I started in 1939. And it actually was World War II started in 1939. And World War II was one big reason why the United States and other countries were able to lift out of the Great Depression and end it. It's kind of ironic. We don't usually think of war as a positive thing, but in this case it did end the Depression. The 1920s, World War I had ended and it was a period of growth and prosperity for some people in society. There were a lot of jobs, there was a lot of growth of industry, people came home, soldiers came home from World War I and were able to work in these factories and new jobs. But on October 29th, 1929, the specific day, Black Thursday, the stock market crashed. Let me explain really briefly how the stock market works, and you'll be able to go into this later in the try it out portion of our lesson. What is a stock market? In the stock market, there's shareholders, also called investors, that guy over there on the left, and they buy a share of a company called a stock. Let's say they buy a stock in Ford. And this is kind of like having partial ownership of the company. So that means when the company, Ford, which makes cars, if they do really well, shareholders, like the guy on the left, get some of that profit. When it works well, the companies benefit because they get money to grow their operations, and the shareholders benefit too because they get to spend $1 on a stock and get $2 back. They get to make money, but it's also risky. In the stock market, they were offered, they actually gave them physical certificates of stocks. And they actually traded it in this, now it's all electronic, but in this day, they actually went to the floor of the New York Stock Exchange and other stock exchanges around the country and traded these stocks to try to make money. The New York Stock Exchange was the biggest and the most famous, and that's where the crash of 1929 happened. So let's look a little bit more now at this video to see what some of the effects of this crash were and how it happened.
The Roaring Twenties, a glittering decade, soon came to an end. But at that time, everyone thought the party would carry on. Groucho Marx, the comedian, earned $2,000 a week on Broadway. On the stock exchange, he doubled it. It seemed that his future was assured.
By the time they came home, they'd call up the broker and see how the stocks did that day, and it all went up 3 or 4 more points. Well, he'd be happy about that, and he'd say, oh, it's better than working.
Wall Street, the pantheon of capitalism. Here, millions could be won and lost. Yet, for 7 years already, no one had lost. The stock market at the top, at its end, out of reach.
And when the market kept going up and up, it drew all kinds of small investors into it. The man in the street, the barber, the school teacher, the postal worker.
Times had never been better. Who was rich became still richer. The poor, on the other hand, had the chance to become wealthy. The stock fever gears America up. New technology boosts the economy and the imagination. The stock exchange game multiplies every single dollar.
They expected it to go on forever, just as they now expect the stock market to go on up forever.
As usual, banks and brokers were doing big business. If the market did not go as they wanted, they helped it on its way. They conspired with each other and manipulated the courses of the stocks. Nothing could stop it.
Al Capone, who was the great gangster, when asked about the stock market, replied, I've got my racket and they got theirs.
In the summer of 1929, the overheated economy was going full steam ahead. More was being produced than could be sold. The first few bankruptcies appeared. Still, no one took these seriously. The Wall Street fever of paper share trading continued.
Investors simply weren't paying attention to the underlying economic trends that were taking place. And some might say that's when greed takes over from common sense.
That summer, Eva Adams' stock hints were very popular. It seemed she knew how each stock would change. Her profession, not a broker guru, but a fortune teller. Groucho Marx was also one of the insatiable clients of Selwyn Sheffro.
They went in regardless of the price, and they overpaid. And so somebody had to pay for it.
The moment of truth came on Thursday in October 1929. On this day, America woke up and a nightmare began. Sold coupons completely covered the exchange floor.
People made offers to sell, and there was nobody there to make a bid to buy the stock. And that was when I would say panic set in.
There was no stopping the panic. Selling became the motto of all brokers.
Prices collapsed, just collapsed.
The collapse of the stock exchange had spread like wildfire in New York. Thousands of people streamed the Wall Street, fearing for their shares. The bankers, the potential big losers, were not giving up so easily. They sat together for a crisis meeting early in the afternoon, led by the banker Thomas Lamont.
Then when that group of bankers left 23 Wall Street, all those crowds out in the street saw them coming out of there, and the report quickly spread that the bankers had formed this great pool of money to support the stock market, so things were going to get better. That did, in fact, stem the tide of selling that afternoon.
No go. The collapse hit everyone. Groucho Marx, the famous comedian, had all his money in shares.
The phone rang, and it was Max Gordon on the other end. And he says, Marx? And my father said, yes. And Gordon said, the jig is up.
The only question was if this was the beginning or the end of the big collapse. Total confusion on Wall Street.
The speakeasies were wide open on Wall Street because you got a lot of investors going in there who lost a lot of money and were, if you will, drowning their losses.
Wall Street dominated the news. Newspapers still tried to reassure people. Bankers fenced off the worst. By the weekend, it became clear just how deep the collapse was and how long it would last.
And the following week, things were much worse, and the rumor developed that the financiers were selling out themselves.
This affected the market dramatically. People were really scared. Bankers left the sinking ship as there was no more hope. Everyone wanted to get out.
The brokerage offices were all filled with people waiting for the market to open, that opening bell, which would tell them how bad things might get. and they got very bad.
Out! Out! Get out of here! Get out of the market before it collapses.
People were just calling up their brokers and say, sell at the market. And panic, of course, fed on itself and got worse and worse.
Not a dream, but a nightmare came true. On that terrible Friday, Wall Street went bankrupt.
That was indeed one of the darkest days in the history of markets anywhere in the world.
The next day, on the floor of the stock exchange, shares were papers of no value.
My father had lost about $250,000, and then but that to him was his whole life saving.
Others had gambled even more. Some had lost everything they owned. In the weeks after the stock market crash, just in New York, a dozen bankers committed suicide.
I remember walking down the street in New York with my father after the crash, and we'd see fellows who used to be the bankers standing on the corner selling apples for a nickel apiece. That was pretty frightening.
The Wall Street crash was the beginning of a worldwide change, a new economic era, the consequences of which, in those days and weeks, no one could have guessed.
The Roaring '20s was often referred to as the Jazz Age. And after the crash in 1929, the music stopped. The great party was over.
All right, you get some sort of scary Nazi foreshadowing as we get into World War II, what will eventually become World War II. Most people didn't have stocks, but this economic crisis affected people all over the world. In the United States, about 1 in every 4 people were unemployed. And for African American households, this was 50%, half of people were unemployed. Farmers especially suffered. Crop prices fell by 60%, and farmers couldn't sell their crops and lost their farms. People who owned homes couldn't pay their mortgages. 44% of homeowners defaulted and lost their homes. And international trade fell by more than 50%, causing suffering to everybody, buyers and sellers. So the stock market crash was one of the big reasons of the Great Depression. It was this catalyst, but it was not the only reason why the Great Depression happened, and certainly not the only reason why it was so bad and lasted for so long. In this lesson, you're going to examine 4 different reasons for the Great Depression. The first has to do with repayments and war debts from the costs of World War I. The second is overproduction of agriculture. What was happening in the farms? What was happening to the farmers? The third is the stock market crash, and you get to dig into that a little bit and get some more explanation. And then the fourth was unequal income distribution. I mentioned that the 1920s were a great time, but they were not a great time for everybody. The rich were getting richer, but the poor were not feeling that same economic benefit. And so you're going to look and see, how did that lead to depression as well and make that stock market crash even worse? And then your final question that you're going to answer for the Show Me What You Know is you're going to make an assessment. Which of these is the most important reason for why the Great Depression happened?